Let's not comment on the hair. I had some heat damage and was trying to do a big chop at the hairdresser, so I just need to get used to this and do some styling. Anyway, I wanted to comment some more on our review of the drama. I am a adult psychiatrist, and while I don't work with many patients that would fit the profile of Zendaya in this film, I have done my own reading into the phenomenon of people who commit mass violence and atrocities, people with various pathologies. So, and just being a psychiatrist, I'm interested in this stuff. So, I wanted to discuss in brief why I think this film is really interesting, but it doesn't work from a psychiatric perspective. So, this is jumping off what my wife was saying at the end of the review. What drives individuals potentially to, or very likely to, these moments of mass violence, right? A moment of grabbing agency and enacting revenge to take back power. And I would actually agree with her. And that's in part why this film doesn't work, because it doesn't convincingly show us this experience for the character of Emma. And I'll explain why. Okay, so 2 points. There's the gender, race of it all, and then there is just the character development, her developmental history, and just her inner psychology as we see it, not necessarily being convincing for someone who almost committed a mass murder. So the Violence Project is a database of every mass shooting in the United States since 1966, or an attempt to count every shooting of 4 or more people killed in public spaces, not including the perpetrator. And it's not necessarily related to like a domestic violence situation. So they found that in that case, so this is the gender, race of it all, going off these statistics, 98% of shooters from this database were men. 4 were women, and 2 of those women worked with men. So just the very strong likelihood that someone who's going to commit like a mass murder shooting is going to be a man. It's just more likely on an extreme level. So when you're in that kind of scenario, you're saying like, oh, well, technically there have been women who've killed 4+ people in a public setting. So that, that to me already kind of, it makes it a lot less believable, because, okay, what about this woman made her the exception from this very significant rule? You're not convincing me of that. 60% of those shooters were white, 40% were men of color, and those men of color often were involved in workplace shootings after firings, so perhaps sometimes different contexts. Okay, the gender aspect, unlikely. The racial aspect, I won't get that into it. It's quite super complex. If you'll see the in our review, we had linked another review by a critic at Roger Ebert. And he wrote a bit about how black women are seen in terms of docility or aggression, and how the film doesn't delve into that enough, blah, blah, blah. So I personally believe this film was likely written in a sort of race-neutral way, or race-neutral white perspective. So I don't think it was tailor-written to Zendaya. If it was, and to Mamadou Athi. If it was, I will eat my words. It just didn't seem like it. It seemed like something that was more not really touching on that. Now, are the actors bringing that to the role? Is that just like ingrained in what we're seeing on screen? I think that the writer-director is more attempting to play with gender than he is with race. And I don't know if the filmmaker or Zendaya really have to do that. Like, why is it that I guess there's inherent racial realities and perceptions that we are going to place on characters. But why do the white characters get to be race neutral, examined in this sort of like, oh, they're the neutral, the baseline, and then the black character has to carry all this responsibility and weight? I'm like, oh, is she perceived as docile? Is she perceived as dangerous? Oh, like we can't step into this idea of like a dangerous black woman. So I'm not as interested in that, because like I would like that stuff to be explored. I just don't think the film has to, and it's really not capable of it. And then let's get to the psychiatric perspective. My wife had a lot of really good points. I wish I had like responded more in our review to be like, yes, that's exactly it. What is driving someone to kill people on this level? Like, can you imagine it? How could you do that? It's not just a matter of trauma or ostracization, right? Some people who endure the most horrific traumas experience pain, isolation. They're never going to commit a mass shooting. They just would not be willing or capable of doing that. So you have to see it, I think, from a developmental standpoint, and you need to see that in the character in a more convincing way, and from a like characterological theory of mind perspective. This has to be someone, Lynn's made this really great point. What was it? Nature loads the gun and nurture pulls the trigger. That was some quote she saw somewhere, like related to this idea of the developmental aspects and genetic aspects that are going to feed into, and then the experience, right, you go through in life that are going to feed into violence. You have someone, and this is research shows that these people who are committing these like mass atrocities, mass murders, they often come from childhoods of trauma. That is just seen really consistently and often. We don't see that in this film. We don't see someone who is failing to develop healthily in a lot of ways. Like, her parents seem fine. Her upbringing seems fine. Are there genetic aspects of just like difficulties with certain ways of socializing and how she interacted with her environment? Like, we don't see any of that. We don't see any developmental traumas. Okay. Then you have to have someone that maybe just through that trauma or, experiences with others, they develop a sense of blaming others for their suffering. Maybe they are suffering at the hands of others with bullying, social isolation. And they develop a deep sense of resentment and blame. And they want to restore their sense of agency and power and order. They are driven by resentment. They engage a lot of like denial, disassociation, trying to overpower their shame through acts of violence to feel more powerful and dominant, so that they can escape sort of pain of a failed self and humiliation. And there's also often you may see sort of disassociation and splits in the self. So people feel like, oh, there's another self who's actually carrying out this violence. But either way, it's an attempt to, it's a dehumanization of the other. It's a blame sort of placed on the other, deservedly or not, right? I'm not saying victims of mass shootings deserve it, but if someone's being bullied, I'm not saying they're not being bullied. They're not suffering in society. And that's where the question of empathy the film brings up. Okay, whatever. Violence as a way to gain agency and to no longer be a victim as you perceive it. And you have to have, obviously, to kill people, you have to have reduced empathy and intense grievance. To be able to dehumanize others in that way, it requires this sort of psychological deficit or spiral that is so potent. You can't imagine like the horror of it, right? It's a reduced theory of mind and mentalization, ability to imagine others' inner worlds, to form attachments and to feel connectedness, to feel like other people are like real and not these stick figures, or sort of objects, enemy objects. You have to like have less emotional regulation and less of a internal moral compass that's functioning properly. Less less empathy is going to enable you to kill people, right? So this is deep psychological scars and fractures and deficits. Okay, so maybe that's stemming from trauma, from personality disorder traits, from psychopathy, whatever. And Lynn's pointed out, my wife, that I'm just gonna keep saying that. This can manifest on a different scale, from like less extreme to more extreme, right? Maybe it's just someone who's narcissistic. Maybe it's someone who is abusive in there. She mentioned all these points. I was like, yeah, like you don't necessarily just become a mass shooter. Maybe you become abusive in personal relationships or become a CEO. Maybe this anger and self-hatred turns more inwards or more outwards. Usually these mass murderers are going to also trying to annihilate others. They're also going to annihilate themselves. All of that is not convincing with the character of Emma, right? They hint at her not having any friends, at never having relationships. But I mean, I see a lot of patients who've at 30 have never had a relationship. That could be for many, many different reasons, and it doesn't mean that you are just like deeply broken. It's that, to me, in and of itself, is not convincing enough. She actually seems quite, while she seems kind of like this wounded bird type, and she seems to not have a full grasp, there's almost like a denial and shallowness and a disconnection from that self who contemplated mass murder. It's not convincing enough for me to believe she's someone who was in a state of like such reduced empathy. That's not just a state you fall into when you're suffering and then come out of, right? You have to have some real wounds and psychological deficits. That how do you come out of that? That's a difficult question. Of course, there are people who do, but to be able to develop a full sense of like others' humanity again, and of emotional coping, and to be in this relationship, maybe you could have made it convincing if you had shown a bit more of that lack of empathy, of that dysregulation, of maybe why her relationship with Charlie works is that he also has those deficits. I would absolutely believe that. If he bullied someone until they moved away, he is cruel, okay? And he didn't care. And none of them at that table at dinner during the confessions cared. There's some really interesting questions there, and it was left unexplored. And that was, I think, given how much you go into Emma in this way that's like more superficial, it's just not convincing. So let me know your thoughts. I think what could have been more convincing is really delving into the actual relationship and to Charlie as well, and seeing exploring their empathy for other people. How can we in the audience be expected to have this radical empathy for this character, right, that the others lack? They lack empathy for Emma, curiosity, but we're not given enough to empathize with or to believe. Let me know your thoughts.